Christoph Wisbicki, he pulled 510 kilograms. But there are some big caveats to this 510 kilogram, aka 1,125 pound pull.
So you would think you would want as many opportunities to see which athletes you're going to send as possible. And China's like, nah, we're going to win it all anyway, so what does it matter?
And look, Dauda, he didn't come out of nowhere last year, but he surprised folks. Who's to say someone couldn't do that this year? Welcome to Strength Weekly, the weekly internet, YouTube, digital show, whatever you want to call it, that brings you everything you need to know from around the barbell game. I am one of your hosts, David Thomas Tao. I am joined by the incomparable, the irreplaceable Beyonce voice, Phil Bleckman, and we are bringing you some big lifts, big news, and previews from around the strength sports world. The run of show today on Strength Weekly, we are covering Christoph Wisbicki deadlifting 510 kilograms beltless and off the blocks in training. This is not a world record. This is not even a competition lift. So how do we contextualize massive feats of strength like this? Phil and I are going to dive into that and maybe argue. Geez, I hope so. Our second segment, Team China withdraws from the 2024 Asian Weightlifting Championships. Wait, Team China, the most dominant weightlifting team in the world for nearly 2 decades, withdrawing from a major competition just months before the Paris Olympics. Segment 3, a new study reveals 2 training techniques to maximize muscle growth. Some new research peels back the curtain on our biology, and there are some really important takeaways for how to gain strength and size if you're looking to do those 2 things. And segment 4, the biggest bodybuilders in the world will throw down at the 2024 Arnold Classic Men's Open Division the first weekend in March. Phil Bleckman, what are you most excited about today when it comes to this? I don't mean what you had for breakfast or what you're going to have for lunch.
I always get excited to talk about the Arnold Classic, but I mean, the weightlifting news is kind of big in an Olympics year. It's kind of real big. Kind of big.
But Phil, first and foremost, Christoph Wisbicki, he pulled 510 kilograms. This, under different circumstances, would be the heaviest deadlift of all time, the heaviest weight that anyone has ever put on a barbell and lifted off the ground to full lockout. But there are some big caveats to this 510 kilogram, aka 1,125 pound-ish pull. What do we need to start keeping in mind when we hear about big lifts like this? Because this is impactful. This is historic.
Yeah.
What does it count for?
So it doesn't actually count for anything other than our entertainment and, you know, where the possibilities for mankind could go. Wisbicki pulled 510 kilograms off of blocks. Now, they're not like the blocks that are at his hips. You know, they were low blocks, but it was not a pull from the floor. And he pulled it in sumo, which is not conventional. So we are going to get into that a little bit by comparing what a conventional lift is to sumo. And I know that who doesn't love talking about that? It's a very courteous and cordial debate. And then
no one has ever physically threatened anyone in the comment section of social media over the sumo versus conventional debate. That much I know of. This is sarcasm. This is sarcasm. People go off on this.
I have never been personally threatened over my preference of deadlifting. So once you get up into this space, this nebulous space of the heaviest ever, there are so many different things that can affect what that actually means because there's no necessarily standardized thing. So it's really just, here's what humans are theoretically capable of. And Wisbicki is at the forefront of that. Now, even though he did do this deadlift off of blocks and he used lifting straps because who has a grip to hold that much weight? One thing that he didn't do, which he's been now notorious for, at least in our coverage of him, dude does not use a belt. Like, the posterior chain on this guy is insane. Like, he's just like, yeah, I'll lift this thing. I don't need any, I can brace myself. I don't need any equipment. Maybe my grip isn't necessarily that of the Hulks, but I don't need help from a belt, guys. Brace yourself.
Thanos style, to continue the Marvel Cinematic Universe reference, I'll do it myself. I don't need no belt. Here's the thing about powerlifting. You can deadlift conventional or you can deadlift sumo. You cannot use straps, and depending on the competition, you may be able to use a lifting suit or not. Right? You can certainly use a belt. He just decided not to. Compare that to strongman competition, which is the format that something like the World Deadlift Championships is contested in. You cannot lift sumo. You can only lift conventional, but you can lift equipped and you can use straps. In fact, you can use those figure 8 straps that like lock your wrists onto the bar, right? So there are 2 basic types of deadlift competition that we cover at BarBend. Powerlifting, sumo okay, straps no okay, strongman, straps okay, sumo no okay. A lot of these that are sumo with straps don't count in either of those realms of competition. I just want to be very clear here. So is this a world record from the like standpoint of it's contested, right? And there are judges. No, absolutely not, especially because this one was off the blocks. Let's be honest. This is really just an example we're using to illustrate that, like, these don't necessarily count for anything, but there's this weird in between, this middle of the Venn diagram. When you use straps and you lift sumo, we see the heaviest weights of all time being pulled, but they're not going into the record books. Phil, I think you put it very well. They're just showing maybe what the human body is capable of, right? But they're not contested. So they're not world records. It might be the heaviest weight of all time, but it's not a world record. But that's to contextualize it. These are impressive feats, but they're feats. They're not competitive lifts. Maybe someday someone will hold a competition where the barbell and calibrated plates are standardized and you can lift with straps in sumo. It is not today, and it is not us.
When we cover these events and we cover actual world record deadlifts, I like having these sort of lifts in the back pocket, knowing for like what the top end of the range is. So when you see a big guy like Jamal Brown or whoever pull an insanely heavy deadlift of, 490 kilos or whatever, you're like, okay, I know that the heaviest we have ever seen on camera ever in any capacity is 510. And if this dude is not using blocks and is not using straps and is, pulling raw at, 20 kilos under that, that is unbelievably close to what the heaviest ever seen is with equipment. So I like it as a gauge, as a reference point. And as you said, it helps contextualize how heavy the actual competition, the sanctioned competition lifts actually are.
We cover this stuff. It's interesting. It's good context because we're trying to bring everything you need to know from around the barbell game, but we're not calling it a record. We're not taking those editorial liberties. Let's talk about something we also didn't take editorial liberties with and move to the world of weightlifting, Phil, because Team China, the most dominant force in international weightlifting for nearly 2 decades, has withdrawn from the 2024 Asian Weightlifting Championships. And I want to point out, BarBend basically broke this story, not to brush our shoulders off, not to toot our own horn too much, but Brian Oliver, who is a noted and very accomplished weightlifting journalist who recently started writing for BarBend, verified this news with some documents that were not made public just yet. But Team China has withdrawn, which very much changes the landscape of the Asian Weightlifting Championships this year. Phil, why else is this a bit of a head scratcher / something we should pay attention to?
This is a head scratcher on our end because it's an Olympic Games year, and the quota of athletes that are going to be able to compete in Paris for weightlifting is limited. So you would think you would want as many opportunities to see which athletes you're going to send as possible. And China's like, nah, we're going to win it all anyway. So what does it matter?
Yeah, it's interesting because like the question for China is like their roster's so deep, who are they going to send? Right? Because they can only send one lifter per weight category, right? Especially with the cut in quota for athletes, for the number of athletes who can compete at weightlifting in Paris, it's going to be a very small number relative to previous Olympic cycles. So we know that China's going to send a full team. It's just we got some question marks in certain weight categories. Who are they going to send? These international competitions are often a way to figure out who's showing up stronger, and it's just one fewer opportunity for them to do that. Now, the Asian Weightlifting Championships is scheduled for early February in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. China will not be there. This definitely opens up some possibilities for other folks to take home some medals in those weight categories. It really changes the field. There is one final Olympic qualifying event China has not withdrawn from. It's the IWF World Cup a little later this year. I do want to read a quote from a representative of the Chinese national weightlifting team. To ensure the systematic winter training of our athletes and adjust their rhythm for competition, after careful consideration, we have decided to participate in the Thailand World Cup scheduled at the end of March, which is also a compulsory qualification event. And that they were giving that quote in response to withdrawing from the Asian Weightlifting Championship. So there you go. We'll see him in Thailand. We won't see him in Uzbekistan. Phil, speaking of very strong people, it wasn't until recent decades that we really knew how the human body gained strength and muscle size. Like we knew what hypertrophy was, but we didn't know a lot about the biology. Sort of like we don't know a lot about why humans sleep or the mechanics behind it. 2 studies came out, and studies come out a lot. We reported on these on BarBend, but these had really interesting, potentially direct implications for folks who are training in the gym and how to maximize their training. Phil, do you want to give us the rundown of what these 2 techniques are that we now know a lot more about, have more peer-reviewed research behind?
Yeah, there's been a recent flood of research that has been embracing the notion that training your muscles in their lengthened positions is more favorable for hypertrophy. If you were to do a bicep curl where you're staying in your shortened range of motion towards your peak contraction, that's when your muscle is at its shortest, right? It's the most peak contracted position of the muscle. Now, in its fully lengthened position, That is the portion where a lot of research has showed that like the activation, when it's in its lengthened position, it's put under stimulus in its lengthened position, is where it's actually going to grow the most after the fact. The other big takeaway that they have found in this study, at least, is how long each rep should take during a set. Now, they agreed that going to muscular failure, which is when your form starts to break down, is still good for hypertrophy. That wasn't questioned. They reinforced that. The takeaway that they did have was how long each rep should take en route to muscular failure. And that, they said, should be around the 2 to 8 second range. Now, that's a long range. For if you do fast reps, you'd be surprised how long 2 seconds actually is when you perform a rep. Like if you're not thinking about it, you move through reps way faster than that. So 2 to 8 seconds is a really, really wide range. The caveat that really stuck out to me was explosive concentrics are still valuable. Like that is still shown to remain effective for hypertrophy. Extending your eccentrics, so the negative portion of your lift, extending that for more time to get within that 2 to 8 second range is where they're saying it's offsetting gravity taking hold of the lift. So if you allow the weight to move down too fast, gravity is probably offsetting a bunch of the stimulus that would be placed on your muscle during that eccentric. And they're saying by resisting that, by allowing the muscle to actually move through its eccentric to lower the weight, take more time. And that's where you're going to see more gains. And that's where they found working in the lengthened position, which is what you're doing when you move into the eccentric phase of the lift, is where there's gains to be had that if you're not doing, you're leaving on the table.
Phil, can you give us examples on these two techniques, like how one might implement those into one's training, for example?
Yeah. So let's just make it easy and we'll do a bicep curl. Okay.
Well, bicep curl. Let's talk about the first technique, which is training in the lengthened position of the muscle.
Yeah. So if you're doing a bicep curl, if you are at the bottom of the movement, you want to put some amount of stimulus in the lengthened position. This is where something like working with cables and having a moment arm, a little bit of physics, but having a moment arm where there is some amount of tension placed on the muscle in the lengthened position to maintain that position. So if you use a barbell and you just have it hanging down, gravity is doing all the work there, right? That's a position of rest. There isn't any stimulus placed on the biceps. If you use a cable and you're facing away from the cable machine and you have a little bit of pull, while you're in the fully lengthened position, your arm is straight, there's still a little bit of that tension. That tension is being held in the biceps to hold that position before you actually move into your contraction.
You want to have stimulus and you want to have force exerted on, you want the muscle to be exerting force at the lengthened position. So for example, the bottom of a bicep curl, as opposed to the top of a bicep curl, because the muscle is in a lengthened position at the bottom of the curl. It's in a shortened position at the top.
So let's say you actually reach the end of your set, you go to muscular failure, you're going to do a drop set, but you're going to do partials because your form has faltered. Doing those partials in the lengthened position where your muscle is longer, so the bottom half of the range, that is going to likely lead to more hypertrophy gains based on this study than working in the shortened position will. Now, there's gains for both. You should still do both. There isn't anything to say that working in the shortened position is obsoleted or anything. But this study is showing that there is more effect to be had for hypertrophy gains working in the lengthened position by doing that.
You know, the biggest takeaway from this, full range of motion on the pull-ups, folks. Full range of motion. Go all the way down, because that's going to create more tension on the muscle from both the bicep, which is in the lengthened position, and the lats, which are also in the lengthened position at the bottom there. Okay, Phil, let's give an example of the second takeaway from this study.
Yeah, so the second takeaway is the essentially rep tempo, how much time each rep should take. And they gave a very wide range of 2 to 8 seconds, as previously mentioned. And what that means from a practical standpoint is if you explode through the concentric and you have a strong bicep curl, that's okay. But when you lower the weight, you should take more time to lower the weight. And more time is really just like, okay, if it takes a quick moment to actually lift the weight, lowering for 2 seconds is more difficult than it seems. I promise you, it's a lot harder than it seems, especially when you get to the back end of a set. So just slow your eccentrics down, and that will likely lead to more hypertrophy gains over the course of a long program.
And just to reiterate, folks, if you want to learn more, we have this covered at BarBend. But the narrative study was titled Optimizing Resistance Training Technique to Maximize Hypertrophy, a narrative review, and it was published in the Journal of Functional Morphology and Kinesiology. Some names that you might have heard of if you are in the fitness influencer and research space: Jeff Nippard, who is a longtime content creator in the space, Brad Schoenfeld, and Milo Wolf, all involved in this narrative study. So pretty interesting stuff. Well, we have a preview of probably the second biggest bodybuilding competition in the calendar year. Yeah, second biggest. And that is the Arnold Classic Men's Open Division. We have 12 competitors slated to take to the stage in Columbus, Ohio in early March. Phil, who are some of the big names who will be competing?
So the returning champion, Samson Dauda, is going to be in Columbus. He will be there to defend his title, as well as a former Mr. Olympia champion, Hadi Chupin, is going to be in Columbus, Ohio as well. He was the runner-up in 2023 after dropping the title to Derek Lunsford, and he's got to get some momentum back. Yes, the Arnold Classic is pretty much widely accepted as the second biggest bodybuilding show of the year behind the Olympia. Pretty clear. There's no debate about that, really. There are 12 competitors in the show. It feels, and I would be surprised if it's not just a two-horse race. It's going to be Chupin versus Dauda for the title. They were in the top 3 at the Mr. Olympia a couple months back, and they will be fighting for this again. Now, if Dauda defends and beats Chupin here, that would bode very well for what Dauda's trajectory looks like in the Olympia later in 2024, because Chupin beat Dauda at the 2023 Olympia. Chupin got second, Dauda got third. Derek Lunsford obviously got first. So if they go into the Olympia where Chupin is slipping down ranks over 2 major competitions, that bodes extremely well for Dauda. Now, if Chupin beats Dauda, then we will likely see the rematch of Chupin versus Lunsford for the title in 2024, unless Dauda makes some significant changes.
And look, Dauda, he didn't come out of nowhere last year, but he surprised folks. Who's to say someone couldn't do that this year as well? You know what I mean? It's always fun to see some surprises. And I think Dauda's emergence as one of the top competitors in the men's open division was a pleasant surprise for fans last year. It really shook things up and has continued to have ripple effects through the bodybuilding space in the men's open division. So fun stuff. This is a fun competition. Our first chance in the year to see the top guys conditioned and on stage in Columbus.
For a little bit of a recap, last year, it was pretty expected that Nick Walker was the front runner to win the Arnold Classic. It just seemed as though Walker had all of this momentum behind him leading up to that competition. And the upset over Walker is what really put Dauda even more so on the map, in addition to, like, of course, it is a huge deal when you win the Arnold Classic. But one thing that was notable in the lead up to that competition is even though Nick Walker had all of the momentum and the clout and the expectation, Dauda had this, like, clear respect from like all of the top legendary bodybuilders from former eras, like Coleman, and think of a major bodybuilder like that is retired now. They were all like, yeah, Dauda would have been very good in our era. Like they all had they clearly respected the flow of his physique, and then that happened to just resonate with the judges as well. Those were the beats going into the 2023 Arnold. Going into the 2024 Arnold, it almost seems as though Dauda is the favorite to defend, even though he's going against Chupin. So Chupin has to like somehow overcome that like narrative that seems to be in place, because Dauda has only gone on an upward trajectory over the last year, where Chupin slipped a rank. Now, he slipped from first in the world to second in the world at the Olympia. He's still one of the top 2 in the world, but the momentum feels like it's in Dauda's favor. So what Chupin is going to do on stage to overcome that in a subjective sport, that I think is also a very exciting aspect to the show.
Excellent. Well, Phil, that brings us to the end of Strength Weekly for this year. For this week, because we'll be back next week with even more. Until then, make sure you like and subscribe. Until next time, I'm David Thomas Tao, joined by the irreplaceable Phil Blackman. Thanks for tuning in, folks.